Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark Allen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyour-ear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. And if I had £1 for every time Joni Mitchell had been mentioned on our podcast, I'd be able to retire very comfortably tomorrow. She's, one of the pole stars around which we revolve, and the subject of a fantastic new and very original new book called Travelling, On the Path of Joni Mitchell, by the broadcaster and the music writer Ann Powers. Ann, it's lovely to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here with you across the pond.
Well, I'm sorry to get you up so early because I think it's 8 o'clock your time, isn't it, in Nashville? Is that right?
Yeah, and it is Music City, so being up at 8 is not normal for people in this town, but
unless they've been up all night. Yeah. Actually,
it's the only way if you want to enjoy any aspect of the great outdoors, because it's like 100 degrees here every day in the summertime. So it's not so bad. I get to go out and walk my dog and not turn into a fried egg on the sidewalk. So I guess that's a good thing.
I can see the very substantial ceiling fan you've got behind you. So I know. I've been in Nashville. I know how hot it is. But it's great to see you anyway. It's a terrific book. But I just wanted to start really by saying, well, obviously you've been a huge fan of Joni Mitchell all your life. Can you remember the first time you heard her and how old you were?
Yeah, I have been a fan of Joni, but as I write in the book, I was like sort of a qualified fan. I had, I'm the right age that my teenage idols were like Kate Bush and Debbie Harry and Chrissie Hynde. So I'll kind of cheat on that question and say the first time I heard Joni Mitchell was really through the voice of Kate Bush, I feel like, who I now realize after many years of not playing them side by side was incredibly influenced by Joni Mitchell on her first few albums. Like if you put Joni's first 3 albums next to Kate's first 3 albums, the connections are undeniable. So I heard her influence before I heard her. But then like most, I guess most young white women in America, I somehow got a hold of Blue, Joni's classic album. And then that was the Bible for me when I was a young person. College age, and then I got into his era. So I was really into the kind of greatest hits of Joni, but it was really only doing this project that made me dive so deeply into her entire catalog, which is one thing I wanted to accomplish with the book. I didn't want to focus only on those albums that all of us love, but really reach beyond that to her whole career.
It's just interesting because you're much younger than me, and so I grew up. I'm old enough to have grown up with the hearing them all in chronological order as they came out, and so it's quite interesting that you can enter your way and just and go randomly and steer in different directions.
Yeah, I met a lot of younger musicians in the process of doing this book who that they started their love affair with Joni in the 90s or in the 80s. So, I met several people for whom the gateway was Night Ride Home, including Norah Jones. That's what she told me, because that was the record that was available to her when she was just, late teen, and found her way in through that record, or Turbulent Indigo. So I think it's an interesting thing about long-lived artists, artists with very long careers. It's similar with Dylan, I don't know if anybody really entered with Shot of Love, but I definitely know
they would have exited pretty fast afterwards.
Exactly, but the first Dylan concert I ever saw was the gospel concert for Slow Train Cummings. So I was in high school. So
bless you, and you stuck with him.
I did. Well, I was a Catholic girl, so it made sense to me.
There you go. So it just, I wondered what you thought people originally saw in her. I was watching the other day an amazing clip, which you will have seen, of her in 1965. She must have been about 21, and she's on a Canadian talent show.
Oh,
playing
yes.
Me and My Uncle. Have you seen that clip? It's fantastic on YouTube. And she just stands out and radiates compared to everybody else on that stage.
Absolutely.
So what do you think people saw in her? You know, people like David Crosby or whatever, who saw her very early on. What was it that they realised was going to work?
Well, undeniably her charisma. I mean, she was a beautiful young woman. She had this poise and prepossession and confidence, you know, that I feel was somewhat unusual. But ultimately, too, it was the confidence to play her own songs. She started playing her own songs when she was still in a duo with her first husband, Chuck Mitchell, before she had any kind of name beyond Detroit, where they were living, and Toronto. And that was unusual in the folk revival. I think people forget that the early days of the folk revival, mostly folk musicians performed covers. They performed classic folk songs and show tunes and all kinds of stuff like that. So here comes Joni, and she's writing these songs, right? And not only are they hers, they're very original, even though initially she did have the influence of both Buffy St. Marie and Joan Baez pretty heavy on her shoulder. But nonetheless, she had unusual tunings. She had unusual way with the melody. And I think it just like stood out because it really was different.
There's a bit where you quote Tom Rush, I think it is, who says she wants to be really, really big. And she will be, but it won't be enough. So I thought it was an amazing quote. What do you think? What was driving her, do you think?
Yeah. I think there were a few things. She had come from suburban/rural Saskatchewan, so she was eager to escape her childhood home, which I think she felt to be stifling in some ways. But she initially thought she would be an artist, you know, a painter or an illustrator, and so the idea of greatness that she carried around with her from a young age was not the usual idea of pop fame or even folk fame. You know, she was thinking Van Gogh. You know, she was thinking all these great painters. Like, how can I be a Picasso? So she had quite lofty ideas of what art should achieve. So I think that's part of it. You know, her love of the classics really instilled a particular kind of ambition. Then, of course, she went through a lot of changes very young, not only leaving her home behind, but then she became pregnant when and entrusted a baby in adoption when she was 21. And that's when, not long after that, she leaves the Midwest and she goes to New York. And that's when her career really begins. So that's something she carried with her.
No, it was. I was going to ask you about that, and also about her childhood illness too, because I think they're really interesting. And you write a lot about both of them very, very interestingly.
Thank you.
And with the baby, she had the baby adopted when she was either 20 or 21. I can't remember now. Yeah. And I wondered if, if that contributed to her drive to succeed, because when you've made that decision, I mean, partly obviously she couldn't support the baby and the circumstances were very difficult, but also she wouldn't have been able to be a singer-songwriter. She wouldn't have had a musical career had she remained in Saskatchewan being a mother. So do you think that was part of her drive to succeed?
Well, as an adoptive mother myself, I try to not speak for other people who are in adoptive families, because every adoption, we have a saying in the adoption community, which is every birth is the same, but every adoption is different. So, I can't speak for her or for her daughter, but I will, or for her daughter's birth father. But I will say that it's interesting. I found there were many women who succeeded in popular music in this era, the 60s, had children they either entrusted in adoption, or in Judy Collins's case, her husband fought her and in a custody battle, took away her son for a few years. You know, Aretha Franklin had children young that were raised by her relatives. Patti Smith entrusted a child for adoption. Maggie Roach. There's just many cases of this. And I just think, so I think there's always a lot of stigma attached to adoption and unfairly. And so I do think that loss and maybe just the carrying around the knowledge of it motivated Joni. I think that's something that motivated a lot of women in that era. And it was really hard I read about this in the book, like very difficult to raise your children and be a full member of a music community at that time. Carole King was able to do it, but she also started her music career in a marriage that then dissolved. But she was very young when she started, had a lot of support. By the time she gets to LA, she's doing all the supporting, but Carole King had the amazing ability to compartmentalize and keep her family life completely separate. I think for Joni, having the mobility that she had, being able to move at will from scene to scene, from city to city, was a huge part of her development. So, whether or not, I'm not going to make a value judgment, but it definitely enabled something in her to not be raising her daughter.
No, I can completely understand. And there's a moment early on in her career where she's being kind of sold as the new big thing. And
yes, yeah.
You think, and you talk about the kind of how psychologically undermining that would have been. And I wondered to what extent she had any control over the way she was promoted.
Oh, well, she fought back. I'll tell you, I did some interesting research in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I got to look through Jerry Wexler's papers and Ahmet Ertegun papers. And there was a lot of talk of Joni, of who supported Joni, why it was important to support her, what when she was unhappy about the way she was being marketed, which was frequently, the executives freaked out because they knew that this artist held a special place among other artists because she was, almost instantly revered among singer-songwriters. And I mean, Crosby was her mentor as well as briefly her lover and her producer, but everyone in that circle thought she was the greatest, So when things happened, like there was a marketing campaign that, kind of used suggestive language. It used phrases. It was she had not put out a record for a while, so the phrases were like Joni Mitchell takes a really long time, or just like kind of sexy. And she was infuriated by this. And I found these interesting.
She complained
letters.
to Mo Austin. She did.
She did, and they. Austin told the marketing department to back off, and I saw the letters that I'm sorry, I want to say his name is Stan Cornyn. I'd have to look it up. It's too early in the morning here, but anyway, the guy who actually he was a legendary ad man, but he had personally written the campaign, and I saw this letter he wrote to Joni, where he's like, okay, I hear you, but you have to understand this is really going to sell those records. And I personally did this, but they did back off after that campaign. And it was interesting to me because I wrote another book called Good Booty that's all about sexuality and music and how sex is marketed through music. And I'd done a lot of research in this period, and oh my gosh, like, the marketing of music in the 70s and the late 60s was like, it was not quite porn level, but it was getting there. It was, there were tons of very suggestive ads. The album covers were incredibly suggestive. There was, I found so many album covers with naked or half naked men. Every band was stripping off all their clothes. And women were getting
Allman Brothers.
Or Grand Funk. Have you ever I call them the nakedest band in rock because they were always naked. It's like, put on your shirts, guys. But Joni did not want to be associated with that. She has a proper streak, She wants to be a serious artist. So when she fought back, they capitulated, and she was able to steer her career in another way, which I think, did it do anyone else good? I don't know. Like, did they look at Linda Ronstadt and not put her in a pigsty covered in mud playing with a pig? Well, guess what? They did not.
They did not
put her in that pigsty. So I don't know if it helped anyone else, but it helped Joni.
No, you realize just how tough she must have been.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Dealt with the things that were going on. There's a film I saw recently, which you obviously will have seen, a lot of people listening or watching will have seen, which is Her at the Isle of Wight. And you just think, I can't believe that this girl on her own at 3:00 in the afternoon with just an acoustic guitar and a dulcimer, facing 600,000 people with the photographers shouting at her, the people coming on and making stage announcements, no security. And you just think, I don't know how anybody survived this. She was obviously very tough.
I mean, contrast that with Laura Nero at Monterey Pop, right? Who basically was Joni before Joni, was David Geffen's protege before he was really involved with Joni. And Joni herself has said Laura Nero's one of the few women who influenced her early on. Yeah. But Nero couldn't take that kind of pressure and delivered a set that really did not go over, and it kind of sidetracked her career, at Monterey Pop. So contrast that with Joni's ability to say to the audience at Isle of Wight, "You're not respecting me. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
I am here for you." And just to have that confidence, even if it comes off as vulnerability, which it does, but the confidence to speak, I think, is extraordinary.
Yeah, that a way that she turned kind of disasters into triumphs, really. It's like Woodstock, they're all at Woodstock. She's not allowed to go because she's got to be on the Dick Cavett show. Sits there watching the newsreels on the telly, writes a song, and actually she wins. That's the big song about Woodstock, written by somebody who wasn't there.
That's the sweetest revenge. It's
revenge.
Quite stunning.
It is. I wanted just to go back to, you were talking about the first record you heard was Blue, and that was the one that really knocked me out when I can't remember how old I was when it came out, 17, I think, But, and there's that cliche that everyone always mentions when they mention that. She says, I felt like a cellophane wrapper on a pack of cigarettes.
Yes.
And Chris Christopherson saying, Joni, save something for yourself. My feeling at the time was that I had never, she was the artist the musician about whom I felt I knew the most. Nobody up to that point had ever been so personal about their own lives. Can you think of anybody, that had revealed that much about themselves?
Well, I think it's important to contextualize and think about how artists reveal themselves, because while she was able to reveal or to construct, let's say, her inner life in her songs. And I think that is a remarkable thing. Like, it's not just the content, the lyrics, it's the rhythms of the songs, the way the phrases flow. You really get the feeling like you're inside someone's head when you listen to a Joni Mitchell song. I think there were plenty of examples of artists who were doing similar things, but maybe in ways, also because she was a woman, her words were taken as personal, when maybe a male artist who was doing something similar, his words might be taken as more oracular, right? So
fictional, possibly.
Yeah, right. I mean,
that's true.
Leonard Cohen was laying everything on the table, including his dirty underwear at all times. We knew about Leonard. Dylan was tangling up his narratives, but there was always a strong strain of autobiography in there too. So those were her pace setters, as she said. Those were her years, and so I think it was pretty natural for her. But it was just the way she wrote that allowed for that feeling of intimacy to develop between her and the audience. I also want to say that a huge and under-recognized influence on Joni was the Beatles. And the Beatles were very influential on everyone in Laurel Canyon, not just because they were influential on everyone, but because Derek Taylor, the publicist for the Beatles and one of the guy who ran Apple for a while and stuff, he lived in Laurel Canyon. Peter Asher was around.
Yeah, managing the Birds, wasn't he, at the time? Doing press for the Birds.
Yeah, and then later he managed Joni for a tiny bit of time. Yeah. But he was around. George Harrison was sometimes around. So I think I see a direct connection to songs like Norwegian Wood.
Yes.
And where Joni goes with her songs.
Yeah, no, that's true. Absolutely. So, talking about Laurel Canyon, again, there's a fascinating section of your book when you talk about how she, I think as you put it, she preferred the boys' club to the girls' club. And that was a really interesting point, because actually she did gravitate towards, I mean, there were a lot of love affairs, and actually we should talk about those too, but she gravitated more towards male company. And in records like Ladies of the Canyon, she's not actually that sisterly towards the women she's writing about, you know.
Yeah.
She removes him like a ring to wash her hands. She only brings him out to show her friends. You know, those kind of lyrics about the other women aren't terribly fond, actually. So why do you think she chose the boys' club?
Well, if we're going to do a bit of pop psychology, you could think about her parents and their marriage. You know, a pretty conventional marriage. And, you know, her mother was, you know, a homemaker, and I think Joni, there's lots of evidence in her songs that she always struggled with her mom and had conflicts with her mom. Now, her dad is the one who kind of brought music into her life, you know, and he played the trumpet, he played jazz records at home. So I think even from an early age, she was seeing maleness as dynamic, and maybe saw femaleness or femininity as restrictive. And there are lyrics in her songs that support this pop psychology read of her. And she was also, by using her own word, a tomboy as a kid. She preferred to play with men. I just think she associated the male world, the homosocial world as it is, with freedom, with action, with you know, everything. And hey, this is before women's liberation. There were restrictions placed around what women could accomplish and what women could do. Also, but by the time she's working as a musician, she's seeing how women are treated, and how, you know, there's usually only one woman kind of allowed in every group to stand at the same level as the men. And in Laurel Canyon, it was complicated because there were the mamas and the papas. They were kind of the royalty of the scene, kind of. Just as Joni's coming in, their era is starting to end. But think about that group. That group was run by an incredible misogynist, John Phillips, who had married a teenager, Michelle Phillips, and, you know, enlisted a great artist, Cass Elliot, and then threw her into a role that was really confining, and complicated by the fact that Cass Elliot was in love with Denny, the other guy in the band. So it was all very complicated, and there just weren't that many women in the scene who seemed to be able to stand on their own. So I think... Well,
Cass Elliott's a good example, because she was kind of very much presented as being a mother first and a kind of musician second, wasn't she?
Yeah, and it's such a shame. I'm glad that Owen, her daughter, has published this new memoir really telling her mom's story, because Cass had so much talent and really had so much she could have done, and was well established on her way to a great Broadway career before getting recruited for the Mamas and the Papas. But then, kind of became this hostess with the mostest in the scene, you know? And so you did have Carole King, and she was doing her thing, but she didn't really she wasn't hanging in the same way. She was going home to her daughters. So she maintained a professional distance from things. So there was a lot of it took a lot of strategizing and kind of improvised strategy for Joni to hold her own in these spaces. And it wasn't always easy.
No, there's a Rolling Stone interview I remember reading, I think Ben Fong Torres, I think, when he arrives and she's cooking a rhubarb crust, and you kind of think she's making an effort to appear
She made
domestic.
so many pies. She made so many pies and put them on the window.
Knitting sweaters for Graham Nash.
I know, but what's funny is... I just have to tell you about that. What's so funny is that I found 3 or 4 of those interviews where she's cooking, baking, making trout almondine or something. And Graham Nash in his memoir is like, we didn't cook, the occasional salad.
Salad cooking.
Yeah, all they did was make a salad. So that was all, that was,
all
I think Joni wanted to project sort of a feminine allure, a hippie queen allure. And she could do it. She learned those things from her mom, but I'm pretty sure as soon as the journalist was gone, the pie was in the trash and she's back to her guitar.
Absolutely. There's talking about Graham Nash. You talk quite a bit about the love affairs that she has, and I felt that with all of them, really, the significant ones of the people that we recognise, David Crosby and Graham Nash, and even and to some extent James Taylor, and certainly Leonard Cohen too, that they all felt slightly upstaged by her.
They did.
I interviewed Leonard Cohen, and he said, I asked him about Joni Mitchell, and he said that someone had said to me, "What's it like living with Beethoven?" And he said, it's no fun. Why would it be? Because he said it was incredibly competitive.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
Do you think that's true, that she kind of, in some ways, had the upper hand in those relationships?
Upper hand is complicated because in the social structure and the business structure of the music industry, I think, as we were talking about before, when we were talking about that ad campaign that she was able to diffuse through her influence and because of the respect of her peers, the fact that she had the respect of these men, which she earned by standing next to them, and insisting on it, that helped her. But she still is a woman, and I mean, the fact that she didn't get to go to Woodstock, yes, okay, it was because she was going to Cavett, but there was also a sense of, wouldn't it be kind of muddy up there? There is a bit of that. It wasn't for that reason. That story was told that way for a lot of years. It wasn't for that reason, but still, I think women got put in certain lanes, but she constantly wanted to be out of them. But one thing I say, and David Crosby reinforced this when I interviewed him not long before he passed, was Joni Mitchell was right there when you formed Crosby, Stills and Nash. She was right there in your, wherever kitchen you were in. You could have had her in that group. Now, she may not have ever wanted to be in a group, but the fact that you wouldn't just naturally absorb her the way that's group
interesting.
I'd
never thought of that.
Yeah, and he said to me, because
Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Mitchell.
It would have been interesting. Because when I interviewed him, it was near the end of his life, and he was playing with this band, the Lighthouse Band, that had two women in the band. And he was going on about how wonderful it was to play with women and how much he regretted not having played with women in the past, like professionally. And I'm like who? Like Joni? And he's like, yeah, really, it was an opportunity lost. So not that she would have necessarily said yes, but it would have been nice if he asked.
That's really, really interesting. Yes. How do you feel she was about her critical standing? I always got the impression that she felt she never really got, and I can really sympathise with all musicians if they feel this way, because you're never going to be completely happy with the way people see you. But I mean, when she put out that album, the Greatest Hits album, it was hits and misses, wasn't it? She put out a load of tracks that she thought deserved greater recognition. So she was very keen that people understood and appreciated what she'd done.
Yes, she definitely was frustrated by the way Rolling Stone portrayed her, even though...
Which is really kind of shocking now when you look back on it.
Well, because honestly, I went through every page of every Rolling Stone from the first time she appeared on the cover, which was very early in the life of the magazine, to about 1975. And while yes, in the random notes, the kind of the gossip column, she gets poked fun at and, treated like this, her love affairs get addressed. And there were a couple cases, which I talk about, where sexism definitely influenced the coverage. I mean, she was covered more lovingly than almost any other woman. There was a general double standard, and I think she felt that. I just think Joni didn't like anybody belittling her. She, as I said, she carried around this very heavy crown in a sense. What I mean is, like, she needed so much to think of herself as in the league with the great artists she admired. And those great artists were mostly not musicians. They were, great writers. They were Nietzsche, Nietzsche, whoever, and or painters, as I said, or classical composers like Beethoven. That it was probably not only humiliating, but a little frightening when she was reduced to a joke in Rolling Stone. And Rolling Stone had so much power then, it was the official organ of rock and roll. So it wasn't the only publication out there, but the other publications out there were even more irreverent. I mean, Cream was even more irreverent. So Joni never really rocked with irreverence. She didn't handle irreverence very well.
No, and also kind of fell out with the music industry to some extent. I mean, in 2002, I think it was, she gave that interview when she described the music industry as a corrupt cesspool. I remember this. She said, "I'm quitting because the business has made itself so repugnant to me. Record companies are not looking for talent; they're looking for a look and a willingness to cooperate." And that was pretty outspoken at the time, wasn't it?
I mean, it's not true, right? I mean, we know, especially in 2002. You're thinking about it. She's an older artist, and how's she going to compete with Britney Spears or whatever if that's the standard? Yeah. But at the same time, I think, I think we also have to think of her as a product of the classic conventional record industry, and she's not a product. Joni, I would never reduce you to a product, but she's working within the conventional recording industry, and that meant that she was made into a product. So, that inevitably has a short shelf life. And I think she was frustrated by the way that women over a certain age just were kind of put out to pasture. Not much was expected of them. Yeah. But she was also frustrated that certain of her peers seemed to be able to break through that, especially the men, like Don Henley, for example, when he had The Boys of Summer, or Tom Petty, who's a little younger, but not that much younger. Peter Gabriel, who was her duet partner and friend. These artists, these men could still be making hits all the way into as they entered their 40s, 50s, 60s. Well, 60s, not quite. But anyway, it was so much harder for women.
You could argue that those men, it's a completely fair point, but those men were making much more commercial music, weren't they? I mean, they were making...
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is why I think this is why it's important to assess her 80s output. There was something, I mean, I will say, I have come to love the albums she made in the 80s with her then husband and producer, co-producer Larry Klein. I love that stuff. To me, it's so innovative, and she's really working to learn new things, and there's a lot of playfulness and fun in those records. And I think there are songs that could have been hits, but it's just much harder to market an older woman than it is an older man. I really think that's what it comes
completely
down to.
True. I couldn't agree more. That's a particularly good bit in the book, because you can think it's one of those periods when she seems so happy. She's married to Larry Klein, with whom there isn't that kind of level of competition or whatever. And Larry Klein's got a Fairlight, and he's working out these. He's got his new toy, and she's downstairs writing lyrics and comes in and offers a bit of music, and it's just a wonderful thing. It's a very, very productive.
It's very romantic. Isn't it? Yeah,
it's romantic.
It's very romantic.
It is.
And I think it's a complicated relationship. She'd never had a co-producer before, so that says a lot about the fact that she continued with him for as long as they did continue, and then after their marriage ended, he continued to be.
He went on work with. That's right.
Producer on many projects, and I mean, and he was the one when she started doing the work with strings and figuring out a different way to sing her songs and present them to the world. That's him. He's in there producing the record that Vince Mendoza did the arrangements for, where her tunes are like standards. So, that working relationship is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, you describe it again in it's a fascinating section where she works with Thomas Dolby, and Thomas Dolby's got all this, again, Fairlight technology, and he wants to do songs a different way. He wants to build them up layer by layer, and calls her in to add the bits when he wants them. And of course, she's just thinking, "This is not the way I work.
Yeah,
I'm Joni Mitchell.
Exactly.
I've always done things completely differently. I thought that was really they kind of didn't get on, really, did they?
No, and it's a shame, because she had been working with synthesizers since the early 70s, and Stevie Wonder was her. That was her guiding light in the 70s, and she really wanted to be making music more like Stevie Wonder, and it was discouraged to do that by the people around her at that time. So it should have worked out better, but these things happen, and I think moving on beyond Dog Eat Dog, which is a strange record. I love it, but it's a strange record. But go to Chalkmark, which they're still being super innovative, and it's Larry and Joni. And all these different guests, Willie Nelson, Peter Gabriel, Billy Idol, all these people. It's a fascinating record that I feel like if you liked Hounds of Love or something, you should check out Chalkmark, because it's got that kind of what happens when Prague meets the 80s, it's got that vibe about it. And I love that.
Yeah. She becomes gloriously grouchy in middle age, which I quite like about her, really, because, it also seemed so different from my perception of her when she was younger. Of course, I knew very little about her anyway. There was so little access to her. But she suddenly, this kind of gruff, kind of bad-tempered, uncompromising character came out, which I thought was very interesting. But look, I wanted to ask you about the comeback, I suppose, if we can call it that, because it's really interesting, and you've got a very original take on it too. But it all, I suppose, to some extent, it started when she had her terrible illness. She had a brain aneurysm, didn't she?
Yes.
And in fact, very movingly, you quote her quote to Cameron Crowe, which she talks about how she had to learn to walk 3 times in her life, which is interesting. The polio episode, obviously, and now this. Yes. And and that, I thought that was quite interesting that she came back at that stage when she got ill. She was therefore inactive, and it kind of focuses people's minds and intensifies people's relationship with artists when they know that they're ill and they're fragile, and that began it, I think.
I remember when news of the aneurysm was spreading over the internet. I can remember exactly where I was standing when I saw it on my screen. And I was, at the time, I was a Joni fan, but not a super fan. But I was thunderstruck by how intensely people reacted, how I could tell this was going to be such a personal loss for so many fans, in a way that I had not really witnessed. I mean, it was different with the death of someone like Kurt Cobain, who was taken in his prime, or took his own life in his prime. But for an older artist, people mourn that older artist, but they don't feel like, oh, how can I go on? But there was this how can I go on feeling about Joni. And it made me realize how personal and intimate people had formed, these relationships with her, these imaginary or parasocial relationships with her, but they were that intense. So then when the story of her comeback starts to leak out, and there were several years during which I incidentally was starting this project, or not so incidentally, because one reason why I decided not to try to speak with Joni Mitchell was because when I started this project, no one knew if she was speaking, period. She still wasn't clear about where her recovery is going to go. But I know Brandi Carlile, I've interviewed her many times and stuff. And so when these Joni jams started, these gatherings at Joni's house where people would come and play music, I knew they were happening, and I knew she was like getting better, and I knew she was receiving visitors, and et cetera, et cetera. And I heard through the grapevine when she started to sing at them again. And the minute I heard, oh, she's singing again, I knew, just having spent so much time thinking about her drive and her commitment to making work, I knew from that moment that I heard she was singing Summertime, that was the song, the first time at a Joni jam in her house, that would lead to the Hollywood Bowl. I knew it, because she's not one to just lay back and do anything casually, nor do anything for herself. It's very
interestingly, you don't kind of totally applaud this idea of her renaissance, do you? You kind of I think you describe yourself as being reluctant to cheer it. So why was that? I thought it was quite interesting, really.
Well, I wanted in writing that, I wanted to convey my doubts, not make a critical judgment about the Joni Jam. I really wanted to illuminate how someone who loves an artist for their whole career has sort of a main character in that. So an artist is very different characters throughout the arc of their career, right? So if you love Dylan, you might love the young Dylan of Greenwich Village. Maybe you prefer the glam Dylan of the late 70s, or maybe you're crazy and you prefer the Christian Dylan, whatever. But there's different Dylans, and you that's your favorite Dylan. So I think it's the same with Joni, where people feel very attached to certain Jonis. And I myself had become quite attached to basically like the 70s, 80s, even 90s Joni. I liked the experimenting, daring, musically expansive Joni leading a band. And this was campfire Joni, And I mean, I say that with love because I honestly, when I write that, and I quote Michelle Mercer, another Joni biographer who had a similar reaction. I think when both she and I felt that, it wasn't fair to Joni and it wasn't fair to Brandy or the people who put together the Joni Jam. They were where she had to be at the time. But we have this other Joni that lives inside of us that remains, our goal. So I think it's just a little bit of an examination of what you expect from an artist. And so that's why ultimately I pull back and say, this is not Joni on stage with Pat Metheny and Jaco Pastorius. This isn't Joni at the Fez.
But is it not a case of her doing it for herself rather than for us, in a sense? It's a recovery that it's a personal challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, but you don't have to recover in front of thousands of people. So it's a performance,
And also, I suppose it changes your view of her legacy slightly, doesn't it? It was kind of,
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it was like, it just, initially, especially the first couple, Newport especially, I felt like, oh, are we going to just now get Joni playing circle game all the time? And
yes.
But here's an interesting thing, and I think I say this in the book, but I'd be happy to say it now. As the Joni Jams have continued, her hand is very clear in those set lists, and she's doing interesting songs like Sex Kills, for example. She's throwing in songs you wouldn't expect, and that's her all the way. That is her all the way. And so I see the value in this kind of setting. I also will say that I think it took some time as Joni continued to recover. It's taken some time for the Joni Jam to figure out how to best support her and let her shine, as it were, inside of that structure. And I feel like the Grammy performance really showed you how far they've come, and how well now that community around her is able to lift her up without covering her over with their own voices.
And also, the fact that the pop music landscape now is so populated by solo girl acts, solo female acts, that Joni is bound to be a major reference point. But before, when it was a kind of broadly male thing, everyone was talking about the Kinks and the Beatles and the Stones or whatever. No, I think that must have made a difference too, I think.
Oh, yes, I definitely think. I mean, and I will say that one thing about this moment, as opposed to, say, the 90s, when there was a turning of the wheel that put women in the spotlight, the Lilith Fair era. During that time, Joni was resistant to be associated with the younger women. She didn't want to be lumped in, and many women artists didn't want to necessarily be, even though there was Lilith Fair, a lot of women artists didn't want to be lumped in with other women. Now I think we're living in a moment where there's more younger women want to acknowledge their legacy. I mean, Brandy's, she's in her 40s, but look at Olivia Rodrigo. I mean, she's always trotting out older artists on stage with her. And it's very interesting how that's happening. Or Katie Crutchfield from Waxahachie having Lucinda Williams join her on stage. This is something, and I will say in R&B, I think this has been a regular thing, but for some reason among singer-songwriters and white rock artists, it hasn't been. There's been more of a generational divide. So it's great to see this kind of circle game, as it were, of women welcoming older women.
No, it is.
And the older women accepting it.
Yeah. And although I think you said in the book that it wasn't the Joni Mitchell you'd come to value. I think you described it as being all legend and no bite. And I sort of understand that.
No, but the bite is coming back, I have to say.
Bite is coming back.
It is. The Grammy performance, which happened after I finished my book.
Yeah.
I could see that gleam in her eye. There was just her delivery of the song. Healing is a slow process, but I think every time she's performed, you see more of her personality emerging. That's kind of one reason I'll say why it's almost more valuable to watch these performances on a screen than be at the concert itself, because you're going to get a wonderful vibe at the concert, and you're going to feel like the communal love, but you can't watch the details the way you can on a screen. And it's interesting to watch her face and like how she's clearly processing what she's doing, and kind of, again, like injecting that Joni attitude that we love into things.
Yeah. Well, she does remain eternally fascinating. There's a lovely little detail you put in. You think that Emma Thompson in Love Actually was one of the things that also helped bring her back. The fact that she picks up the Joni Mitchell CD. Do you remember that she gets at Christmas?
Oh, yes, definitely. That was huge. And I think about this a lot because Joni Mitchell was never a huge chart success. Like she didn't have a lot of top 10 hits. Her albums always did well, but she didn't chart a lot of singles. So why is she so central? And I think it's because the people who do love her so vociferously that they carry her music forward into the world. But also she was really an artist. So you see her reference so much in not only the music of other people, but in movies and books, in so many different places. She fed the creativity of so many other people. And that's why I think she keeps appearing. Actually, the BBC did a beautiful special a few years ago on the song River and how it became a Christmas song. And it just has these wonderful testimonies from fans about how they needed that song because it was allowing them a space to be melancholy at a time when everyone else was forcing cheer down their throats. So I think that her music is sort of it really is medicinal for a lot of people, and that's a special role to play.
That's a very good point. Very, very good. Yeah, we all, it legitimizes feeling that way, doesn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. It gives you a guide.
She is eternally fascinating, and there's all sorts of new perspectives and revelations in your wonderful book. And again, it's called Traveling on the Path with Joni Mitchell, and it's out now. And it's lovely to talk to you. Thanks so much.
This was very fun. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.